Start the recording. So I have to first start off by acknowledging that we have some students who are attending the course asynchronously. What that means is they can't make it to class hours simply because they are either in a full-time job or have some big commitment which prevents them from doing so. And in those situations, what those students are allowed to do, and this is just a rule that I have, not it's not uniform across Laurentian or anything of that sort, is that they can view the recorded lecture and send me their comments as evidence of engaging with the material in class participation. So we have two comments here, and I'll read them out to you. One of them is from Anastasia, who's in on this class. And Anastasia's comment is regarding knowledge and information, and it goes beyond depending on experts for information. People in the field who have lots of experience are also good sources of information and knowledge. And the second question she has is for the, we were talking about study design, and we're talking about physical activity of older women. I think that was the example we used. And her question was, wouldn't the population size have to be bigger to have more accurate results on such a broad question? So my response to that, Anastasia, is if you remember the question was limited geographically. We were talking about women in Sudbury over the age of 65. And that's the only thing we're trying to answer. We're not, you're right in the sense if you want a more general uh, conclusion that we want to come to, if you want to talk about all women in Canada or all older women across the planet, yes, we would need more power. It's called power, analytical power in the sample, which essentially means a massive sample size and more representativeness and so on. So sometimes we are limited in what kind of samples we can acquire. It doesn't make the study invalid, it just makes the study limited. And researchers will, sorry, did you have a comment?
I did, based on my question, now when doing this sample, because you're trying to be specific, would this specifically be for Sudbury in the greater area, or Sudbury including some of the communities like Lively and other stuff around that are considered different districts of Sudbury, as I was told in the sample? Is it that limited?
Well, it's a Sudbury amalgamated in, I believe, the late 80s, early 90s. I don't remember the year, but it is considered part of Greater Sudbury, and everything is run through what we call the Tom Davies Square, the city center.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, so it's amalgamated. They used to be different towns.
Yes.
Regardless, it would be up to the researcher to specify precise geographic coordinates and determine what's applicable and what's not.
Okay.
So, yeah, there is it really is up to the skill of the researcher to identify the limitations and tell you what the geographic area is, what the distribution is, and what rules apply and what don't. Okay, so those were Anastasia's comments. We have one from Bharati. Bharati hasn't been in class just yet, but he works full time. I don't know if it's a he or she, and I apologize, Bharati. But Bharati's comments were also pertaining to the research question itself that we would design. And it was more of a general question. So I don't think it necessarily adds to the discussion, but thank you for your question, Bharati. Now, we should move back to the exercise. So what we will do, we have 18 students, not all in class, but so we'll have a few different people participate because we don't want to go through 18, then I wouldn't finish what we need to for the class. We'll have a couple different, we'll play the game called fastest finger or fastest hand. Whoever gets their hand up first can go. Okay, so. Hey, this is, don't, you know, you don't have to compete or anything. No, I'm joking. Anybody wants to go first for this exercise? You're required to come up with a research topic, preferably one that interests you, and specify how you can rephrase that as a problem statement. Okay, so we have Tree and then Steph. Excellent. So Tree, you can start, and then we'll have Steph go.
Okay. So I'm wondering about how much more, if we have more mortality in long-term care since COVID-19. So I guess since March of last year.
Okay, Steph?
I'm interested in social networks and their relationship to mental health in seniors. So my question would be, do older adults 65 and older in Canada who spend more than 10 hours on Facebook a week have less poor mental health days?
Sorry, all weird short forms, but you get the idea. Okay, Arthika.
What I'm interested is the immune system and how, with the introduction of COVID, how it's impacted their immune system and how the body responds to this new, I guess, virus.
Immune system of, okay, immune
Of
system.
older adults, I guess.
Okay, so we'll quickly go through each of these three questions. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm not going to have more questions just for right now because this is enough for discussion to get us started. Okay, Tree, do we have more mortality in long-term care since March? How do we answer that question? How do we make it answerable? How can we rephrase that question?
So for me, I would be interested in long-term care homes that were not affected by COVID. And I would like to see Canada-wide what's happened. And whether or not we have increased mortality. So I guess we'd have to look at mortality rates in long-term care. I don't know. I'm really not sure how to answer the question, but I do know that that question's too broad and not narrow enough. But
okay, okay, so let's try to work. Let's try to give a couple different possibilities, and based on how we frame the question, it'll answer different things. Okay.
Okay.
Okay. Because mortality rate is defined. We know what that is, deaths per 100. What is the change in mortality rate pre and post over a 1 year period, over, we have a specified timeline, over a 12-month period, pre and post March 2020 in Canada in long-term care homes, LTCHs in Canada. And that would be a sufficient question because it's specific enough. What is the change in mortality rate? So you would need data for all the long-term care homes. We're assuming there's a hypothetical organization which will compile that and give it to you, or you have a poor struggling student that you can put towards it and pay them a few bucks, either or, and they'll put that data together and over a 12-month period and look at the change in mortality rate. So it becomes a very answerable question at this point.
Okay.
Okay. All right, Steph, do older adults or people greater than 65 years or older, older adults who spend more than 10 hours or more on Facebook, you're interested in knowing if they have more or greater or fewer mental health days, correct?
Then those who don't, who spend less.
Correct. So if we were to frame that as a, do you have an idea as to how you would frame the question so it's absolutely researchable?
Let's see. Yes, do older adults 65 and over who spend 10 or more hours on Facebook have fewer mental health days than those who do not spend 10 hours or more on Facebook?
And the thing is, your question itself is quite complete. So even your starting point is pretty good. So that's
Yeah.
why there's not much framing left to be done. So if we can frame it as a hypothesis than a research question, so we can hypothesize that older adults spending greater than 10 hours.
Oh, I forgot to specify Canada.
Okay, we can put that in the hypothesis. Older adults in Canada spending more than 10 hours on Facebook.
Oh, sorry, 10 hours per week.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ooh, well, this is a smart class.
Yes.
To have fewer mental health challenges. So this is where we have to specify. We don't know what these are. So this becomes an unanswerable, okay?
Yeah, I said poor mental health days because that's a metric I saw in another study about physical activity. But I don't know a lot about that. That in itself still seems kind of vague and highly subjective.
Right, but you might be able to use, say, responsive behaviors.
Yes.
Okay, so that's something you can count. So we can leave it like that. There might be different things you're looking for. It might be incidences of depression, maybe a score on an MMSE, which is the mini mental state exam, or whatever it is. So we'll leave that as it is, but just remember that it has to be refined a little bit more. But then older adults that don't. So yeah, very good example. I have a couple comments. I'm going to look at it after we do the third one. I'm not ignoring the comments, people. Thank you for them, but we'll just, okay, Arthika, immune system of older adults post-COVID. That's her curiosity thing. Arthika, how are you going to frame that? Do you have a comment there? Let me see.
I guess maybe go more specific with maybe older adults with Alzheimer's and investigate, I guess, the immune system and how this new, host or environment impacted that.
So what is your measure of the immune system, Arthika? Because we're trying to measure something. What's your measure of the immune system?
I guess maybe look at the mortality rates. I'm not really sure.
Okay, so if you're curious about something, so there are, so Arthika, again, we'll not break this down too much, but things to think about. So if you are a non-immunologist, one of the ways to talk about what you perceive as better immunity might be fewer instances of illnesses, right?
Yeah.
That's something you can count, something you can document. A very crude measure, but we'll pretend that you have accountable. Okay.
So maybe, I think someone made a comment about colds, so maybe we can measure.
Yeah, and that's fine, and absolutely. So Tree says maybe more colds. So, and then the other question is, when you're saying post-COVID, Arthika, are you saying these older adults have already had COVID, or are you talking about a situation where COVID is all everywhere around, and it's probably affecting? So that's something you must specify as well. And again, don't have to do it right now, but things to think about, because when you say in the presence or absence of something, what are you exactly saying? And then Anastasia says, I think that if you're being specific about COVID and the immune system, you need to study the after effects of other strains of COVID when considering how COVID-19 may have effects on older adults currently. I think it's very complicated because a lot of older adults are actually being knocked off their feet and ending up with ventilators. So I'm not sure you can specifically study their immune system post-COVID. You'd have to actually work with survivors.
If I can make one thing,
Go ahead, Anastasia.
The few things I'm looking at specifically, which when people are talking about older adults in COVID-19 and how it's affecting them, is in one of my previous courses that I did, I looked at the after effects of different strains of coronavirus like SARS and some of the other pandemics that we've had, in how it talked about how it can have effects on your liver and how you may get weakness and other stuff from it, and many other effects that people were having as they had aged older, which is something I think is a lot to take in effect, especially for the aging population, as well as if they had anything like that or other previous health conditions that, along with coronavirus, if they had gotten this illness currently, it can have other huge effects on the outcome of how they're feeling and how they battle this disease as well, too, because that can have a huge effect on many outcomes of the immune system and other parts of the body as well when dealing with this. I know it's a longer study, but stuff like that I think might be valuable in looking into this question, even for previous research too.
Great comment, Anastasia. So as you can see, I mean, even when we ask questions, there is so much complexity involved that it's not as simple as saying, well, this is very interesting, I want to study it. The question has to be very, very specific. So, and again, you know, we're learning how to frame researchable questions. That's the objective of the exercise. We're not studying coronavirus in for any specific reason. This is just, you know, this was something that came out of the class. We're trying to reframe that as a research question. So yeah, just you know, as we go through this course, we will all become much better at framing our research questions. Even when you have 2 or 3 questions in class, some questions are going to be framed more systematically or in greater detail than others. And then you just work. I mean, even as a researcher myself, I often have very vague questions that I come up with. And then I just work on breaking it down and making it what you probably saw in research literacy as operationalizing. You operationalize your hypothesis or research question. Cassidy has a comment saying longitudinal study has to be done. And that's a decision people have to make, whether it's going to be cross-sectional, whether it's going to be longitudinal, and so on. Okay. Good, thank you everyone. This was good exercise. Right. Okay. Then we talk about disciplines. So you have to remember the first 2 chapters in your textbook are introductory chapters. We don't necessarily get into the nitty-gritty of too many of the concepts themselves, because they are coming up in subsequent lectures. So yep, if you are thinking why we don't cover them right away, it's because they will come. Okay, disciplines of research. So one of the disciplines of research, this is different from the phases of research. The phases of research tells you procedurally what the steps are, and there are 3 different phases, and each phase has a bunch of different steps. The first phase is the longest phase. It has almost 6 steps. The second is a little bit shorter, and so on. The disciplines in research are areas that you have to actually focus and get them right while going through the phases. So one of the disciplines of research is the creation of your research question. And that's what the previous exercise was. It was trying to set us up to create a research question or hypothesis. What we have to remember always is when we write or ask a research question, research questions are meant to be limited in scope. They're not meant to be all encompassing, okay? They're not meant to answer everything. Okay? And often when we try to ask a question, it's a portion of something. If you're looking at studying heart disease in women with unhealthy diets over the age of 65 in the city of Greater Sudbury, that is embedded in a larger context of heart disease and unhealthy diets, or heart disease in women, or heart disease in general. The very big picture is heart disease. That's the very big picture. And then you have portions of the picture and so on. So the complete picture, I mean, you'd like to draw it as a hypothetical circle. And we are probably answering a very small sector with our research question, very, very small. If you can imagine the circle as being infinitely large and your section being very, 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 very tiny component. And that's when research is the best, when we are not trying to ask very broad, massive questions and actually going after something that's very answerable. Granting agencies will often look at what your proposal states, and brilliant proposals which propose way too much are never funded, not because the proposals aren't good. It's because it's simply not possible. And there's too many what ifs, so they won't fund those proposals. A research question, one of the features of a research question will always identify something that's measurable, something that's tangible. It's always going to be something that you can, no matter who looks at it, when they look at the process and when they look at the results, everybody can see it. You don't have to convince anybody for, to be able to see that answer. Your textbook goes into the need for honesty and accuracy. And there are several reasons to be honest. One of the big reasons is the usability of information. So the problem with having information that's not usable, as you can imagine, is that the whole premise of research is it is built on the shoulders of other research. So any research, you look at literature, you see what's out there, you look for gaps in information, and then you build on it. It's layered information finding. So when you have something that's not accurate, something that's fake, it's a massive problem, because people following up, assuming that is true, will reach incorrect conclusions. And there are several examples where there has been either very bad research or just straight up lies. One example is, I believe this was I think it was in the New England Journal of Medicine. There's a guy called Wakefield. And for those of you who took research literacy and those of you who you don't, just a fresh reminder, Wakefield was the physician, him and a couple other physicians. They essentially did a very limited study, and they came up with the conclusion that your MMR vaccines were the cause of autism. Now, there were multiple problems with this. Not only was this research team a powerful team, so they had credibility because of who they were. It got published in a very prestigious journal, and it sent off huge shockwaves in the United States, with people refusing to take vaccines because they believed that their children would develop autism. Even now, there's a very strong anti-vaxxer lobby in the United States, and there are people who simply won't do it. And this is not religious. This is because of a lack of trust with the vaccine system and assuming that there's enough mercury in the vaccines to do something to children. Okay, Wakefield subsequently retracted his study. Okay, he had to retract it because other researchers following up, because this information was not honest, they found that this was not true. They could not show with any degree of confidence that vaccination was related to the development of autism. In fact, when they did comparisons of children developing autism who had never had vaccines, the numbers were quite comparable. There was no statistical difference whatsoever. So Wakefield ended up retracting his article. More recently, there was a researcher from the university that I did my PhD from called Pullman. Pullman went to McGill, and Pullman's big studies were in obesity. Very big name, very prolific researcher, but it turned out that he had fabricated a whole bunch of his data. And this was revealed by someone who worked for Pullman. I don't know if I spelled his name right. Anyway, Pullman was, so he did all these things. He got himself into a high enough position at the University of Vermont and then moved over across the border to McGill. And I think eventually he was let go, and he had to retract a lot of his papers. But the damage had been done, just like the Wakefield situation. Lots of people had worked on subsequent studies believing this to be true. They had reached all kinds of conclusions which didn't make sense. And it's problematic. Now, the challenge with it is not only do you lead other scientists on a wild goose chase, wasting their time, their lives, their careers, it's also completely unethical to take public funds, which is essentially grant money, taxpayer money, and then fudge data or to make stuff up. I think the most recent case of fraud, academic fraud, was the South Korean doctor, I don't remember his name, South Korean scientist, who claimed that he had cloned human embryos. This is quite recent in the past 5 years, so you should be able to track this down. I don't remember the last name of this scientist. So he claimed that he had a whole bunch of human embryos that he had cloned. Human cloning is considered unethical, and most countries do not allow it. Somehow this person secretly claimed that he had done it. Well, he didn't claim secretly, he claimed quite publicly, but he had apparently accomplished this. And then he published a whole bunch of things. Again, all of it was found to be fake and fraud. So there's a whole bunch of problem with all of these things. And you have to remember that not only do pieces of research create the foundation for more researchers to come and do additional work and build on it, they're also often the foundation of discoveries. Discovery of vaccine, COVID vaccine was discovered because somebody did the research for COVID vaccine. It didn't come up automatically. Someone sequenced the gene for COVID. Someone realized that, okay, this, I'm not intending to get technical, so I'll keep it very brief. This is an RNA virus. So they figured out that using RNA, they could actually get people vaccinated and so on. Okay. Another suggestion is to never selectively use data to fit theory. So cherry picking information is always a bad idea. The idea is that you have a hypothesis, but a good research team, a good researcher will never look for data to essentially justify a hypothesis. A hypothesis is intended to be proven or disproven. So selectively using data to fit theory, we spoke about the early research on obesity caused by dietary fat. And we spoke about how initial scientists in the 60s, initially, they cherry-picked data demonstrating countries that had high incidences of cardiovascular situations. And they demonstrated that, well, look, there's lots of saturated food in the US and in Canada and in Australia, and look, and the UK, and this is what happens to people. And they completely ignored cultures like or countries like Poland and France and Belgium, which use a lot of saturated fat, and the incidences of cardiovascular events are quite low. So these are some of the consequences. Can we think of any other consequences that can happen with the dishonesty or lack of accuracy? What do you think could happen in addition to these things? Tree?
Well, for me, the big thing is that it erodes the trust of the public, which can really have some terrible consequences. If we don't trust the science, then we may not listen to things that are potentially life-saving.
100%. We have people doubting scientists even when there is good data and good research. Just look at what's happening with anti-mask maskers, and look at what's happening in the US with people not believing what scientists have to say and why restrictions on socializations must exist. Even in the current context, we can see it. So what happens when a bunch of scientists are shown up as fraud on media? Then what happens to public confidence? It's just shattered. They think of them as being no better than politicians. Right? Steph?
Yeah, like, bad ideologically driven pseudoscience can create huge social problems. I'm thinking of the example of so-called scientific racism. Like, back in the 19th century and stuff, bunch of studies that weren't really studies were done in an attempt to prove, for example, that Black people were an inferior race. And we're still dealing with that legacy.
Yes, and there was a lot of scientific racism, and one of the things, Cassidy has a comment. Cassidy, I am going to get your comment, but let's talk about Steph's comment because it's very interesting. Steph, can you think of an incident where this has happened, a very specific incident of scientific racism?
Okay. I remember like reading a fascinating book by Stephen Jay Gould called The Mismeasure of Man. And I read it a long time ago. And there, like, he cited several of these studies. Like, one of them was sort of they studied kind of army intelligence IQ testing, and sort of used that data to kind of, you know, prove their hypothesis that, you know, Black people were less intelligent. But he went and he analyzed like all the problems with this research and how like these questions are ridiculous, like they were culturally specific, for example, and, you know, it was just a totally erroneous conclusion.
100%. So the scientific racism, and that's a great example. I've read the same example, but we have to also think of, go back to World War II, Nazi era, where everything was about Aryan supremacy. And, the Nazi scientists spent an inordinate amount of time justifying how the Aryan race was superior to everyone else. And there were a lot of completely unethical experiments done with essentially prisoners in concentration camps and so on. So there's that. There's the Black racism. Then there's all kinds of situations in Canada where Aboriginal people have been studied by outsiders, essentially older white men, and various conclusions have been drawn about different things. So there are a lot of issues of lack of honesty and accuracy in your research, and part of it is lack of objectivity. Even more than honesty and accuracy is a lack of objectivity, a lack of balance, and so on. And it's unethical, right? That's a massive problem. So a part of honesty and accuracy, I know record keeping, the title that is there in your textbook is shown as a separate section, but record keeping ties into honesty and accuracy. Cassidy's comments are, well, I'm just going to go through the comments before we talk about the next section. What do we have here? Cassidy says, uneducated individuals, I feel, are more vulnerable to false statements. And it's, that's interesting. Uneducated is a very complex term, but in general, uneducated means perhaps not having had a high level of schooling. But I tend to look at the universe as a university that does not offer degrees. Our world around us, our society, it's a large university that just doesn't give out degrees. And often the uneducated are not necessarily people who don't have degrees. It's often the people who don't engage with the content that their world around them is providing and live in their own little bubbles, often ridiculing or ignoring information. So it's uneducated is a very complex sentence. Nothing wrong with it. I know where you're coming from. So if you're uneducated, that is a problem. Artika says can affect the credibility of the author 100%. Readers may question all of their research. True. And Cassidy also says pretty much trying to manipulate the public or even in that topic, which is why we have specialists in the field. One of the challenges in the US, and we spoke about this earlier as to who an authority is that the average person does not understand who an authority is, which is why Donald Trump becomes an authority on COVID, while people like Dr. Fauci, who's been a virologist for 50 years or 40 years, has lesser credibility, which is unfortunate. Anyway. So going on to record keeping is part of the same thread of honesty and accuracy in the sense that one has to keep accurate records, keep a notebook. So most researchers will have a notebook or a work log of some sort. It may not be a physical notebook, it may be an electronic notebook. Some researchers do a lot of audio recording. If they're very busy, they don't want to write notes. There has to be a log of some sort, which allows not just the researcher to go back and check why they did what they did and the rationale, but also if anyone ever wanted to follow up on their work and there was some question about the authenticity, you can go back and take a look. Okay, and hopefully the logic is clear enough that even if you made a decision based on existing logic and it's proven incorrect in several years or decades, someone looking at your notes can understand why you came to that conclusion, even though, you know, some 10 years from now, what you conclude today might be completely wrong. That's the whole point of record keeping. It creates integrity in the work itself. Now, limitations, and this is going back to, you know, one of the things that we discussed just at the start of the lecture. Every study has limitations. There is no unlimited study. There's no super study that covers everything, unless you're Sigmund Freud, who claimed everything was answered by a few of his theories. Sigmund Freud was a brilliant man, no doubt, but he had overarching theories and reached conclusions that were disproportionately, well, which were essentially not representative. Let's leave it at that. So limitations, every study has limitations, and recognizing limitations and stating them as part of your research, it prevents the researcher from overstating findings, okay? So for example, if we look at older adults engaging in physical activity over the age of 65 in Sudbury, and say we approach 500 community dwelling older adults, we have to be very specific in what we're limiting our findings to. We're limiting it to the city of Sudbury, we're limiting it to a certain subsection of the population, and we're not considering a lot of other subsections of the population. So it's important to identify those limitations. It provides a context to the research. And remember, like if we are, all we're doing is studying a very small sector of this large pizza pie, there is no need for us to make big claims on the whole spectrum. We can make claims only about a little sector, and it actually makes it more believable. It ends up being more believable because of its limitations, and the validity is not going to get doubted. It actually allows for a genuine follow-up and expansion of the knowledge. So if your information is limited to women over 65 engaging in physical activity of 150 minutes a week, that's it. It's limited to the city of Greater Sudbury. Somebody can come up and they can look at a different city. They can look at additional cities or Canada-wide. They can look at lower activity level, or they can look at people who are hyperactive or who work 300 or 400 minutes a week, or they can look at older women who don't have any comorbidities. You know, they can make it more specific and so on. So they can add to that body of information. They can use your information as a reference point from which to move forward. We're then introduced in your textbook, and we'll talk about this, we're introduced to two concepts called theory and data, okay? So what's a theory? Artika, go ahead.
Is a theory, I guess, about something or like an idea or about how things are?
I guess, a hunch, an explanation. Yep. In its simplest form, that's all a theory is. In its absolute basic simple form, a theory, a hypothesis is a little different. Thank you, Alana, for your comment. And we'll talk about why a hypothesis is different from a theory. So a theory is, a theory can be a hunch, but it's basically an explanation, and that's the key part that you want to focus on, and that's why we can separate it from a hypothesis, a thought out explanation to something. Thank you, Jessica. So yeah, it's an explanation of how some things are linked, or how something works, or how something operates. That's what a theory is. A hypothesis is a little different. In a sense, it still operates on the premise of a hunch, but a hypothesis is essentially an explanation which you are going to test. And the other feature of a hypothesis is we often hypothesize before starting a research project, before starting an experiment. So that's what a hypothesis is all about. A theory is a little different in the sense I have a theory that, Sam likes Jane. Okay, you have a theory, okay? Oftentimes it's explaining things that you have already seen. So you've seen a bunch of things, maybe they like to spend more time together, A, B, C, D, and E. The theory is often explaining what's already happening. It may be, so for example, if you find that a bunch of older adults has great health and they're all associated in different activities, so you may have a theory essentially explaining that, there's data to show A, B, and C. So the theory is that people engaged in so many minutes or more of activity per week will enjoy a better quality of physical life. A couple comments here. Let's go through that. Cassidy says you have to prove the theory. Typically, you prove a hypothesis. A theory is an explanation based on a lot of things that you observe. So they sound very similar, but that's the distinction between the two. Cassidy says, so like a belief. Yeah, in a sense, a belief, a hypothesis is more like a belief that you have to work on and demonstrate to be true. A theory is more of an explanation. Okay, good. So a theory can be, and does not have to be, is a statement that attempts to relate to different concepts. Now, typically, if you want to say that students who spend very little time studying are unlikely to do well on exams, that is a theory. Anita says more explanation and different concept. Okay. So a theory does not necessarily have to relate to concepts. For example, if there can be a theory that based on data that we have, that individuals exposed to more chronic diseases are likely to be susceptible to acute infections, okay? And that's based on a lot of data out there. So it just explains why certain older adults are more predisposed to certain diseases because, they have a whole bunch of different comorbidities. Data is different from theory. Theory is completely different from data. Why is data different? What's data? How is it different from theory? So, okay. Well, data is different from theory because data, yeah, Alana says facts. Yeah. Data is essentially measurable facts. We'll add one more word to it. It's all the measurables, right? So data can be anything. Data can be interview transcripts. It can be numbers. It can be video clippings. Data can take any shape or form. So we have to step away from the idea that data is just numbers. Steph says data is meaningless without a context. 100%, 100%. So for example, Steph, did you want to give an example to that? I mean, that's a very good point. Do you want to make an example?
Drawing a bit of a blank.
It's okay. So yeah. Let's talk about median income over the past. Let's talk about median income in Sudbury. So suppose I give everybody a Stats Canada chart showing median income of people, or say even the income distribution in Sudbury, the different quintiles. So let's say income is distributed into 5 quintiles. Quintiles means 20%. So lowest 20, next 20, next 20, next 20, next 20. I show the income distribution of households in Sudbury, and I give you all that data. And I tell you, what do you think? Everyone's looking at the data and like, okay, well, here's the data. I don't know what that means. It's a bunch of numbers. So many people have X number of dollars to X number of dollars and so on. So I've given you data, but it's completely meaningless because we haven't asked a research question. We aren't doing a comparison. We aren't doing anything with it. There's no context. But if I give you quintile income information for a family, for families, okay, for Sudbury, for North Bay, for Timmins, and for Sault Ste. Marie, 4 northern cities. And then I ask you, what can you tell me about the income distribution in these 4 cities? All of a sudden, there is a research question, there's an answerable, and the data has context. We are actually doing a comparison to ask where the different income brackets are, or how much of the population is distributed in what fashion in the different income brackets in these 4 northern cities. So based on that, perhaps you see that maybe in Sudbury, 40% of the population occupies the 2 highest quintiles. That may not be the case for Timmins, that may not be the case for the Sioux. So maybe by virtue of asking the question, creating the context, and providing some more information, all of a sudden you can draw a conclusion from the data that you see. So data without context is irrelevant, 100%. So data is essentially facts or evidence. Thank you, Alana, for that. That's a very appropriate term. And evidence is always in pieces. We never have complete evidence. It's always contextual, it's always limited, and it tells us something about the whole thing. There are different kinds of data, right? You can have qualitative data or quantitative data. It doesn't have to be, only quantitative. It doesn't have to be just numbers. So let's review, and the review section is typically the questions at the back of your book, I believe. So let's go ahead and do that. So it gives you some practice there. And what we'll try to do is make this interactive. We'll try to get most of you to attempt to answer. You may not get everything 100% correct. That's okay. You're welcome to open your textbook to respond as well. Let's see if we can get some of these answers going. And the reason I do the questions at the back is, first of all, it refreshes what we've learned during the lecture period. Secondly, your midterm and your final exam, even though they will be multiple choice, they might just be plays on the questions that you have in the back. So it's a good idea to kind of get a sense as to how to answer these questions and how to think about them. Ireland says, I haven't received my textbook. It should be in Wednesday. Good luck. I hope so too. If you aren't getting your textbook back in a reasonable amount of time, you can always write to the publisher and say, listen, my course is ongoing. I ordered my textbook a month ago, still not here. Can you give me access to the ebook until I have my textbook? And I've often found that when you go ahead and request, publishers will, especially in the context of COVID, they will actually, even otherwise I've seen them do it, they will actually go ahead and give you access for a few weeks to have the textbook. So 2 more comments. Suzanne says, Amazon is super fast, 2 days. Okay, all right. So let's review some of the content. Why do we undertake research? Why bother? Artika.
To answer a question?
Yep. Artika and Tree.
To investigate a claim that someone has made.
Okay. Let's see if we can get 4 reasons to do research. Steph?
I was just thinking in the to add on what we've just been talking about, it can be used to kind of overturn or show as invalid, like bad research that's been falsified or ideologically driven.
Okay. We have 2 comments in the chat window. I'm going to pop them up. Jessica says to verify something, and that would be perfect. It will line up with Steph's comment. Artika says, Catherine says to gain new understandings and perspectives, so expand knowledge. Artika says, settle a debate. Yeah, 100%, 100%. Anything else you can think of? to make important decisions, policy decisions, or when you're working with doctors, physicians to make clinical decisions, practice decisions, so on. Anastasia says to further investigate limited knowledge of interest to specific topic to expand on knowledge. So that would fit there. Okay, good. I hope I didn't miss anybody. Nobody else has their hand up. Okay, good, good, perfect. Yep, so those would be the reasons why we undertake research. Why is research a process? Steph?
So it can be replicated?
Replicable. Carly says, Carly and Artika talk about many steps to follow. I'm going to read the specific comment. Many steps. Something specific about the steps. Anybody want to put the keyword in? It involves many different steps. It's a process because there's steps to follow. Both of them talk about steps. Essential first steps. Correct, but there are. Thank you, Jessica. There are the essential first steps, but there are many steps, not just the essential ones. But more importantly, these steps are interlinked, and that's the word I'm looking for. They're interlinked steps because you can't do one without the others. And Jessica, to your point, the initial steps, or the first steps, are absolutely important because if you don't do them right, then your whole research project might be wasted. Linked. There we go, Steph. Thank you. So the interlinked first steps. So that's why it's a process, because they're not only do you have many steps, but you can't do them in any order. You can't process data before you start having the research question. You can't start to sample before you form the research question. So there are all of those things. So if you mix up the steps, your research project is going to be a massive disaster. It is 100% possible to start collecting data even before you've properly defined the research question, but that's a very, very bad project. Okay, not a good idea to do that. So that's why there are many interlinked steps. Replicable only for the reason that if you do the steps in the same way, the conclusions you will reach will be quite comparable. What's the normal sequence of the research process? So if you ever get a question like this, what I am looking for is, sorry, let's go back a little. Oop. Okay, the normal sequence I'm looking for are the 3 phases. Okay, so what are the 3 phases? You can take a look at your textbook if you don't remember. That's perfectly fine.
I can answer that. Would the first phase be to clarify the issue and select a method? And then the second phase would be data. And then the third phase would be to process the data and look at the evidence.
Data collection, phase 3. Process, conclude, and report. Okay, each of these phases, we went into some detail for phase 1. There's more detail for phase 2 and for phase 3 as well, and we'll look at them. So it's not, but that's how you'd answer this question. So for example, if you got this question on your exam, you might have different choices where you might have something that's the right answer and a whole bunch of stuff that looks like the right answer but really isn't. So it's a good idea to know. And when I say stuff like that, don't assume I'm giving you an exam question. We're just having a discussion. Yep. I'm sorry, I'm not sure why my thing won't behave. Okay, let's try this. Yep. All right. Oh. Sorry, just a second. I'm not quite sure why. Let's just quit this and go back to this. Okay. Oh, there we go. Sometimes my iPad is not my best friend, and in those situations, I'll just restart it. So nothing to worry. Okay, what are the essential first steps? Why are they important? We probably didn't discuss why they're important, but I guess we did informally. But anyway, let's go through the first steps. What are the first steps? You can read through. For the exam, you will need to know them. What are the essential first steps? Anybody? Sorry, if I can't see your hand, it's because when I'm screen sharing, I only have 5 people on my screen, so I can't see if somebody has raised their hand physically. If you do the icon thingy, I can see you. Okay. Jessica, select, narrow, and formulate the question. Thank you. Steph says select a research design. Tree?
Is conducting a literature review part of the first steps?
It would almost precede select, narrow, and formulate a question, because you can't actually formulate a question without knowing what's discovered and what's not. Even though it probably should be part of the research process, it's almost and it's an iterative process. You don't stop reading literature just because you have your research question. You continue to read, so it's almost ongoing. And that's a great point. I don't know why it's not included, and perhaps it is. It might be included in the text. I'll have to remind myself of what the textbook says. Yeah, to formulate the question, you absolutely need to have awareness or knowledge of the literature. So let's review. So select research design. What else? Choose measurables. I think different language is used. So says variables, I believe, in your textbook. Yeah, so you pick your measurables that you'll go have a plan for analysis. For analysis plan, you have to have a sample plan. What's your sample going to be? And analysis and tables. You need to know what you're going to sample. And finally, there's something that isn't mentioned in the initial list, but if you're working with people, that becomes relevant. If you aren't, then it doesn't, which is ethical approval. You don't have to worry too much about ethical approval as if all you're doing is reading existing papers or analyzing data that's already there. So there are a whole bunch of things that are part of the first steps, and it's, just look at your textbook. It's all there. They're important because if you don't do them in the right order, like you have 5 or 6 different things, and if you don't kind of figure them out in the right order, you are going to go through a lot of work, and it might lead to absolutely useless information. There's a term I like to use with my students, GIGO, which is garbage in, garbage out. If you have garbage, which means an unplanned method of going after the first, the steps in the first phase, you're probably going to end up with more of a mess than anything else. So it's a good idea to use the sequence. There is some room available to play around with the order of things. So for example, you can definitely look at your ethical approval you may choose to do your ethical approval right away, regardless of whether you're going to use an interview system or whether you're using a questionnaire, and you can propose both options. So you're actually putting ethical approval even before research design. And those things are not necessarily the end of the world, but you definitely have to create your researchable question right away. You also absolutely have to have your measurables before you do your analysis. You need to have your measurables. You need to have an instrument to measure them, because it's great saying, well, I'm going to measure the growth of all newborns, of all infants in January, February, and March of 2021. But you haven't decided what your measuring instrument is, and you've just said growth, which we don't know whether it's height, whether it's a weight. We don't know what you're going to use to measure them. Is it going to be a weight scale? Is it going to be a tape measure? And finally, we don't know if you're going to use centimeters or inches, right? So these are things that you have to decide, so that ethically you have to decide this before you start your research project. You can't you can change things on the fly if something doesn't work, and then you have a rationale for that. But ideally, you want to set these things up before. What is done in phase 2 of a research project? So there's phase 1, right? These are the steps in phase 1. What's phase 2? What do we do in phase 2? Jessica says collect data. We also organize data in phase 2, collect, organize data. Often we do, there's some amount of processing of data. You don't necessarily reach conclusions, but there is some basic amount of processing that happens. All the analysis part is done in phase 3, analysis and reporting. What are the 4 disciplines of the research process? What are the 4 things that we have to be mindful of? And we spoke about this briefly. So I'll start with the first one. Honesty and accuracy. What's the next discipline? Ask the right kind of questions. Oh, record keeping. Thank you, Jessica. Okay, 3rd discipline, 4th discipline. State limitations. Thank you, Jessica. Last one. Well, data and theory are 2 different concepts that we discussed, but methods. Well, a little bit of a trick question. So we need honesty and we need accuracy. Those are 2, and then we have record keeping, which is number 3, and then we have state limitations of our research 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. What are the major properties? What is the big deal about having a research question? What are the major properties of a research question? It's got 2 properties. So what are the 2 properties, very important properties of a research question? Research questions are limited in scope, right? And it's intentional. You keep them limited in scope because that is what makes them answerable. And the second thing is they always measure something. So they always have measurables. Or they talk about measurables. The question itself may not measure anything, but the research question has to speak to measurables. Okay, all right. Difference between theory and data. I think we had a broad discussion about this. I'm not going to touch this again. 2 major kinds of research. We didn't talk about this in too much detail. Broadly, 2 major kinds of research. I think everybody can answer this quite confidently. The two Qs. Thank you, Artika. Okay. All right. Okay. That's it for the slideshow. I'm going to stop sharing here. A couple of comments, qualitative and quantitative, Carly says, and same from Artika. Okay, that's I think that's it for today, but we are still here till 12:50. So if anybody has questions, comments, wants to discuss anything, good time to do that. Is everyone clear so far? I know some of you don't have textbooks. Just you can use the hand icon to just show me how many people have the textbook versus how many that don't. How many have? Let's ask how many have the textbook. Steph raised her hand. We have 2, 3, 4. Lana says, yeah. Lana. So some of you have the textbook, some of you are waiting on your textbook. Good idea to have the textbook. It's not only mine's out for delivery today, says Cassidy. Anastasia says I have online. Mamina says hands up. Ebook for Mamina, that's good. Okay, good. So most of you have textbooks, and that's good because you're going to need it. This course is dependent on the textbook, and the more you have, obviously, if you have your textbook, it makes life a lot easier. Okay, any questions regarding the content today or last week's class or future classes? I have to tell Suzanne, I find your dog extremely cute. He's been hanging out with you. I think that's pretty neat.
I have 4 now, and they cling. But usually I hide in the basement to do homework.
Okay, fine. As long as they're not going to help you on the exam, I'm okay with it.
No.
Okay. All right. Well, seeing no questions, no comments, no concerns, we will adjourn and meet again on Thursday, same day, well, not the same day, but same place, same time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See
Thank
everyone
you.
on Thursday. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
I found it. Build a boat for treasure. Yeah, yeah.